Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Hurrenque if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Thursday, October the 28th, and today I am joined by a special guest, and that is Alabama attorney Barry Ragsdale. Now, Mr. Ragsdale is of Dominic Feld and Hyde, and today we're going to talk a little bit about something that happened earlier in this week, and that is Governor Kay Ivey's executive order opposing federal vaccine mandates. Now, we had this on AL.com. We wrote about this, and I know a lot of you had questions. We had questions as well about what exactly this executive order does, what exactly it means, and how much power does the state, whether that's Alabama or any other state, have against a federal mandate. So today, now Barry is not involved with this litigation or any litigation that has already been done regarding vaccines, but he is here today as an experienced attorney with a lot of experience in civil litigation to kind of lend his legal knowledge here, we'll say. So Barry, thank you so much for taking time to kind of break this down for us. And when I say that, there's a lot to break down.
There is. Thank you for having me. This is a complicated issue, and it is an evolving issue. I mean, there are literally court cases being decided today as this winds its way through the courts.
Right. And there's a lot to break down here. So I'm going to start with what happened earlier this week with Governor Ivey's executive order. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with it, this is essentially what it said. Now, it opposed federal vaccine mandates. And basically, the governor had directed state agencies to not enforce a federal vaccine mandate, which is scheduled to go into effect in early December, on December the 8th, and also to basically tell these agencies to cooperate with efforts to overturn this mandate and this requirement. Now, there's some kind of more detailed bullet points we'll get to in a minute. But essentially, this executive order, Barry, was not like some that we see in terms of when governors or other people issue these orders regarding storms, right? Or regarding specific recovery efforts, where there's a specific goal for this executive order that say we're going to bring in National Guard, say we're going to order more money to go to storm affected areas. There's usually a very clear point in these executive orders. Now, what was different, I think, about this one, at least for us who have seen these executive orders, there didn't seem to be a clear point in the executive order.
Well, I think the point was that Governor Ivey wants to make it clear that she and her administration are opposed to the vaccine mandates that were entered by President Biden through a series of executive orders in September. The real question is, what does it do practically from a legal standpoint? It requires, as you pointed out, cooperation with the Attorney General by state agencies. Frankly, I didn't think state agencies could refuse to cooperate with the Attorney General, but it does put those agencies on notice that to the extent that our Attorney General is going to file a lawsuit, and I expect him to join in with other Attorney Generals to do so, that the agencies of the state are required to cooperate, the executive agencies, which are under Governor Ivey's control. It also says that the state agencies won't cooperate within the enforcement of any federal vaccine mandate. Now, again, I'm not sure what that really does from a legal standpoint. The United States Supreme Court has previously held that states can't be required to assist or enforce federal mandates. The federal rules or the federal mandates that President Biden has enacted through his executive order would all be enforced through federal agencies, federal rules, and federal employees.
And that's a good point, Barry. And I have a couple of bullet points here on more detailed things of this executive order. So I want to quickly run through them. One, which you just kind of went over, this bars state agencies from punishing businesses and individuals who don't comply with federal vaccine mandates. And two, this is the one that I found really interesting. If a state agency is required to enforce a federal mandate, its employees must notify affected businesses and individuals that the state does not condone the penalty. So they're basically saying, look, we don't like it. That's what that bullet point seems to convey.
I think that's exactly right. I think Governor Ivey wants it clear that, as I said, neither she nor her administration, and theoretically the state of Alabama, do not approve of vaccine mandates. The notion that you're required to stand up and say, you need to know, even though I'm having to follow this federal rule, we don't approve of it. Seems to me to be kind of a aspirational goal that really doesn't accomplish anything. But I think it's important to note that what I think Governor Ivey was trying to do was find out what she could do as the governor of Alabama that would not directly conflict with federal law. And all of these requirements of her executive order are directed at state agencies and directed at people already under her authority and control without necessarily conflicting with what we expect to be the rules coming out of the Biden administration.
And we should note in this executive order and throughout the COVID pandemic, Governor Ivey has said she encourages vaccinations. She has vaccinated herself. And again, she has taken that opportunity to say, look, you need to get vaccinated. But she says in this order, again, while she might support vaccinations and encourage them, she does not want to requirement, and she does not believe requirements are necessary and are something that she supports. So let's kind of talk legally about this. If you have a governor like Governor Ivey who says, look, we're not going to do it. We don't like it. We don't support it. What, though, power does the state have when the feds come in, presumably early December, and put in that vaccine mandate and say, no, this is what it's going to be? Who has the end say here? Who has the final say, I should add?
Well, ultimately, the United States Supreme Court may very well have the final say, but our Constitution makes it clear that federal law is supreme and therefore preempts state laws that conflict with it. And so, for example, the OSHA rule, Occupational Safety Health Administration Act, that has been proposed, not yet issued, but has been proposed by President Biden, would affect all employers who employ more than 100 people. And that would include private employers, obviously, in the state of Alabama. If there were to be, for example, a rule or a statute or a new bill passed by the Alabama legislature that attempted to nullify that, the OSHA rule would preempt that law, and the federal law would be supreme over the state law. So there's really very little that the states can do legislatively. There's a lot they could do in litigation, and that's already started and certainly will continue as attorney generals and governors seek to challenge these new rules. Texas, for example, has already filed a lawsuit challenging the OSHA rule that has not yet even been drafted. And so that litigation is inevitable. I certainly expect our attorney general to participate in that. And I think Governor Ivey's executive order anticipated that by suggesting that state agencies cooperate. And also there's a reporting requirement. If someone is required by a federal law or a federal rule to get a vaccine, they're required to report that to the attorney general, which I suspect will be part of the litigation that Alabama will join in.
So two questions here that are a little bit separate, Mary. Let's go through two scenarios. So scenario one. Let's say I have a business, okay? We will call it, for just the purposes of illustration here, we'll just call it Ivana's business.
Okay.
I have 120 employees. So I have over that 100 threshold. So I'm a private business operating in the state of Alabama. I am registered as a business, as an LLC in the state of Alabama. I have more than 100 employees. This mandate, which has not been, as you said, it just even written yet or even released yet, say it comes out early December, we can even say January for the purposes of argument, that I have to enforce vaccine mandates or weekly testing on my employees because I meet that threshold. Now, I operate in the state of Alabama. I'm a private business. Who do I listen to? Do I listen to Governor Ivey or do I listen to President Biden and the federal government?
Well, in this case, what we're talking about that would apply to private employers is going to be an occupational safety rule, just like a rule that is imposed every day on workplaces regarding exposure to toxic chemicals or wearing of safety equipment or any of the other rules that are implemented by OSHA. And you're required to comply with those rules. I think one of the things, for example, and I give credit to Governor Ivey, she said, let's not put Alabama employers in a situation where they have to choose between complying with federal law and conflicting state law, because that's unfair to businesses. Now, as a practical matter, the law, I think, is clear that the OSHA regulation would preempt any contrary state law. Now, there are likely to be, and almost certainly will be, legal challenges to the OSHA rule. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but this OSHA rule is not like normal OSHA rules because it is going to be adopted on an emergency temporary basis. And that allows OSHA to implement this rule without going through its normal administrative rulemaking procedure. That rulemaking procedure can take years under the normal circumstances where you allow comments and revisions and all kinds of other work. In this instance, OSHA and the federal government are going to be relying on some emergency powers that OSHA has to implement a temporary rule without going through all that process. That raises legal challenges and legal concerns. It also will only be temporary. It would only last 6 months, maximum 6 months, for it to be in effect. There inevitably will be some very serious legal challenges to that OSHA rule, primarily based on the fact that it is bypassing the normal regulatory rulemaking procedure, and also probably on other grounds, constitutional and otherwise. You know, as you pointed out, we haven't seen the rule yet. We anticipate that the rule will, for example, have a religious exemption, that if an employee at your business says it violates my religion to take this vaccine, then there needs to be an exception for that. And I anticipate that it will have a religious exemption, and probably also an exemption if you're able to demonstrate to your employer that there is a specific individualized health problem with you being vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine. That will also be an exception. But at this point, employers, I think, have recognized, and they understand, federal law is supreme in this area. It really doesn't matter what the state does in terms of enacting legislation. Now, right now, there is not a ban on private employers in the state of Alabama requiring a vaccine in order to work there. And a number of employers have on their own enacted requirements of work that say, you work here, you got to have a vaccine. We're an at-will employment state, which means you can be fired for no reason or any reason, so long as it does not violate some protected class. One of those classes or rules that you can't violate is a 1993 law, which was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that requires employers who enact some kind of policy or requirement or prerequisite for employment to accommodate valid, sincerely held religious beliefs. And so as a consequence, I expect any mandate that comes out of the federal government to have at least a religious exemption.
So that was scenario one, which there's a lot of factors there, but it seems like in that scenario, you got to follow OSHA, or that is the expectation there.
Sure.
So let's go to scenario two. So let's talk about these state agencies that Governor Ivey keeps referencing in her executive order. Over and over, this is about state agencies, telling state agencies not to enforce this mandate, telling state agencies to cooperate with efforts to overturn it. So let's take a state agency. Let's just, for the purposes of argument, not just as I'm picking something off the top of my head, let's say the Department of Conservation. All of the employees there, which I assume are going to be more than 100. There are lots of game wardens and other people who work in that department. We go into, again, after, when, if, and after this OSHA requirement is released, maybe at the end of this year, beginning of next year, those more than 100 employees who work for the state of Alabama, what happens to them? Do they also have to follow OSHA, or are they going to somehow just not follow OSHA and follow Governor Ivey's requirements here in her executive order?
This one's actually very easy because the definition of employee under the OSHA Act excludes state and local government employees. So state agencies, people that work at the Department of Conservation or in the Attorney General's office or in the governor's office, are not included within whatever regulation comes out of OSHA because they work for the state. So to the extent that state employees are worried about this, they will not be covered by the OSHA regulation that comes out. The only possible exception is one of the other areas in which President Biden has indicated and issued an executive order is healthcare workers. And healthcare workers who work in a facility or for an entity that accepts federal funds either through Medicare or Medicaid are going to be required to participate. So the Department of Conservation probably does not fall into that category, but there may be state entities, state hospitals, state healthcare providers that do otherwise take Medicare or Medicaid funds who may fall into that exception. But your rank and file state employee will not be covered by the OSHA regulation.
That is interesting, and that's an interesting just differentiation between those two factors and those two scenarios. And you mentioned those federal contractors, and that includes our state universities. They are state universities, but they receive federal money, federal funding. Now, we do have a comment here from the University of Alabama, and I'm going to look down and read this. This is from a spokesperson from the UA system, and she said the universities still plan to follow the federal mandate for contractors such as UA. Last week, they notified employees that they would have to be fully vaccinated by December the 8th. She said, quote, because this vaccination requirement is mandated by the federal government, our institutions do not have the flexibility in its application or enforcement. She said failure to comply will place our universities in jeopardy of losing hundreds of millions of dollars that is received through federal contracts and awards, as well as thousands of jobs that are funded by those dollars. So this puts our state universities in kind of that middle ground that you mentioned a second ago. They are state universities, but they're getting federal money, and they cannot, most of them, I would assume, cannot afford to lose that federal money or, again, the jobs that are in place from that federal money. So that is going to be an interesting unfolding of this entire mandate.
Absolutely. And the way in which, and this is very typical, frankly, of the way the federal government has dealt with such issues for decades, which is tie it to the carrot of federal funds. And that for example, the University of Alabama has to make the decision, are we willing to not comply with this federal requirement for government contractors, which is another piece of the executive order entered by President Biden, and risk losing hundreds of millions of dollars? We can make that choice. If we feel strongly enough, we could make the choice to forego that. I don't believe the University of Alabama or any other government contractors are going to risk losing the access to federal funds in order to buck the system regarding the federal vaccine mandate. And that's how it's tied in there. For government contractors in particular, who have until December 8th to comply, if they receive federal funds, they're going to have to comply with that mandate. And that probably includes a wide variety, but certainly our universities will fall in that category.
And I like the way that you phrase that, because that's very true. You look at federal laws, you look at a lot of federal lawsuits and cases. As you said, it's kind of the carrot there. Well, you can make your choice, but you're going to lose a lot of money depending on that choice you make. Now, I want to quickly talk about something else, and I've got a lot of people asking about religious exemptions here. And now, I'm not a theology major. I'm not involved with every religion or faith out there, so I'm not sure exactly which religions are saying that they do not support it. Barry, you might know better than me. But one thing I did want to mention is that Alabama right now, and this is, I believe, data from yesterday, I looked right before we started, 41.3% of Alabamians are fully vaccinated. So there's a little bit more of a percentage that have gotten maybe their first dose, and they have not completed that vaccine series. But as of yesterday, 41.3% of Alabamians fully vaccinated. So that is less than half, Barry. I know that I'm a writer, I'm not good at math, but even I know that 41 is less than 50%, right? Not that great, not that high. Now, vaccine mandates are nothing new. They have been around since even the 1700s with smallpox. And this is something that many people have gone through, enrolling in schools, having to get your vaccines to enroll in schools or to do other things. Vaccine mandates aren't new. But Barry, have we seen the litigation regarding vaccine mandates, or if you don't like the word mandate, vaccine requirements in the years past? Or is this new COVID vaccine, is this really a changing of the tides when it comes to requiring vaccines?
It's not different in the sense that there have always been opponents of requirements that you get vaccinated. There is a United States Supreme Court case, which I think resolves many of the constitutional challenges, that is from 1905. That was a case from Massachusetts in which a gentleman objected to the city of Cambridge requiring him to get a smallpox vaccination, and objected on constitutional grounds. Interestingly, he also claimed that it promoted paganism as part of his argument. You don't hear that much anymore, but and that case went to the United States Supreme Court, and in a fairly clear 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court said, you don't have the right to object to a vaccine simply because you don't want to do it. You don't have an unfettered right to do whatever you want to, particularly when it has implications for health and safety. The Constitution and at least 200 years of Supreme Court precedent have recognized that the federal government and the government's right to protect the health and safety of others is a very broad power, and one in which the courts allow a good bit of leeway to the government, and has been upheld for more than 100 years by the United States Supreme Court. I think a lot of what you're going to see now is a reaction, frankly, to the politics and things related to COVID that may make those objections more intense and more widespread. I think most vaccine mandates and requirements are going to make accommodation for religious objections. And most employers are not going to question whether or not it's really a sincerely held religious belief or one that you just came up with because you had other objections to the vaccine. But it's certainly nothing new. There have been court cases, and I will say too, there have been recent cases in which the courts almost uniformly have upheld requiring COVID vaccinations. The first case was out of Indiana University, where it required all of its students and faculty to be vaccinated. That case was challenged on religious and constitutional grounds, and the federal courts have upheld it throughout that time period. And so the cases right now mostly have upheld the requirements for a vaccine on both state and local level. There will be challenges, obviously, to these new rules implemented by the Biden administration, and that will result, I'm sure, in a lot of new decisions and probably ultimately a decision by the United States Supreme Court.
But something you just mentioned, I think is really interesting, and I don't think that people have talked about enough before, is that right now there is a precedent from the U.S. Supreme Court, I think you said from the early 1900s, saying, look, you can't just oppose a vaccine requirement because you don't like it. You got to have an actual tangible reason for that, whether it's a religious exemption, a health exemption, et cetera. You can't just say, I don't want to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's important because I hear a lot of lay people talk about what they think the Constitution requires and what the Constitution protects. And what the Supreme Court said in that case, and that case is still good law, is that you don't have some unlimited right to act any way you want to when it could implicate the health and safety of your neighbors. And under those circumstances, the government is justified and within its constitutional powers to be able to require folks to get vaccinated. And that is the law. And that's why I think you're going to see most federal courts in particular recognize that fact and to decline to enjoin or to prohibit vaccine requirements going forward. Now, I will say the OSHA rule is going to be a little different because there are valid, I think, objections to OSHA taking advantage of its temporary powers in this way that are unrelated to whether it was a vaccine mandate or some other rule that OSHA might implement. And I think there's some history to that. The last time, with the exception of some recent rules that OSHA has implemented for healthcare providers, masking, et cetera, the last time that OSHA implemented a rule like this was in the early 1980s, and it involved asbestos in the workplace. And the federal court struck that rule down in part because OSHA could not demonstrate that it was necessary to have this emergency powers to deal with asbestos in the workplace. And so I think there is going to be a burden put on the federal government and on OSHA to be able to prove that it had to be an emergency rule. It couldn't go through rulemaking. That's probably a lot easier with COVID because you have the transitory nature of the virus. You have the fact that it spreads so easily. Obviously, we're facing the fact that over 700,000 people have died in this country, 15,000 in the state of Alabama. We're still having, an average of 500 new cases in Alabama every day. So there is a much stronger argument, but that is clearly going to get litigated and clearly going to be fought out in the courts as to whether or not this OSHA rule on private employers is constitutional and complies with federal law regarding emergency rules.
Do you expect that, again, if this mandate goes into effect and if these rules come out from OSHA in December, early December, as they have expected, as they have communicated, do you expect that private businesses will be monitored, or how this will be enforced to make sure that private businesses that meet the threshold of over 100 employees and et cetera are actually complying with that OSHA rule?
That's kind of unknown at this point, and part of that is because we haven't seen what the rule is going to look like, obviously. But OSHA has enforcement capability that is limited anyway to whatever rules, as I said, whether it involves safety equipment or toxic chemicals or exposure to carcinogens. And OSHA has trouble, frankly, enforcing those rules across the board anyway. Most employers comply as a matter of course. This will carry, by all reports, a very hefty fine, $14,000 per employee per week if you don't comply with it. And so I suspect there will be a lot of voluntary compliance that's not going to require OSHA inspectors to go into everybody's workplace and do that. And I also think, and we've already actually seen this, the talking about the vaccine mandates has caused more people to get vaccinated. I mean, Alabama, as you point out, is still the fourth least vaccinated state in the country, but it's better than it was 5 or 6 months ago. And so some of it is to provide some kind of aspirational policy that people should get vaccinated. And if not, we're going to require you to be vaccinated. And that is probably going to be mostly a function of voluntary compliance by employers.
Well, it is for sure. Nobody can argue this. It is going to be a very interesting next few weeks. And there's going to be a lot of information that we're going to be seeking in the next few weeks. So I hate to tell you, Barry, but I don't know that you're going to get a holiday break. I think we're going to have to, then we're going to have more questions for you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I would be very happy to come back at any time.
Barry, thank you so much. Everybody watching, you've had great questions. If you have other questions that we did not answer, feel free to email them to me, and I will try to track down Barry and get his thoughts on those as well. Put my email here in the comment thread. But again, everybody watching, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow.